Hello, friends. This is Director of Christian Education Neil Meyer at Eastminster Presbyterian Church in East Lansing, Michigan, and joined by Reverend Dr. Jeff O'Neill, who was interim pastor at Eastminster prior to Reverend Kristen Strobel's arrival. And we are glad that Jeff has joined us. We are going to record some of these Zoom chats in this quarantine time to get to know one another a little bit better and have some of these faith interviews talking about faith formation and the things that have shaped various folks from the Eastminster community in their life of faith. So Jeff, thanks for giving us some time today, and we're grateful to have you with us.
Glad to be here, Neil. We're really practicing physical distance, aren't we?
We are indeed, split screen and all. So,
Yeah.
but grateful for the time. So tell us a little bit. We know you came to Eastminster late in your ministry career, but what are some of the earliest memories that you have of church as a young child?
Oh, that's easy because I grew up as a minister's child. And so the church was kind of the center of everything we did. You know, when my father disappeared in the daytime and the nighttime, I knew he was at church doing something. When my mother disappeared for choir practice or rehearsal or this, that, or the other thing, or the Women's Association, I knew where she was. And of course, being a little kid, the church, which was when I was growing up, was a sizable place in the late 19th century structure. It had all these really interesting passageways and hallways and closets that you could crawl through and hide and seek in and so forth. So, you know, the church was both a very serious business in our family and was also a playground for me. So early memories abound.
When did that shift begin for you from playground to something more? When did you become aware that it was even more than just a place where your family worked?
I guess gradually over my whole childhood, but it was certainly always, presented both by the members of the congregation and my family that I was encouraged to consider the ministry, and just whether I felt like it or not, or felt drawn to it or not, which at times I did, and at times I didn't. I couldn't ignore it because it was always brought up in one way or another. So, even by the wider context, I grew up was born in the early 40s, and I went to school in the 50s and 60s. Seeing the church's witness during the Vietnam era or the Civil Rights era, seeing my father and mother participate in those kinds of witnesses in the community, seeing my father confront the fear and anxiety that was produced during the McCarthy hearings against good people in the church, but were being accused of being not only unpatriotic, but communist and subversive and so forth. And his defense of them is something I admired. And it wasn't always pretending to be fully understanding of everything that was going on as a young person, but knew that my own inclinations was to be on the side of the accused, the downtrodden, the weak, discriminated against, all that sort of thing. The models were all around me. It was a great church to grow up in because it was a church whose attitudes were, in my view, very focused on justice and kindness and mercy and so forth. I've always felt privileged that those kinds of influences were in my life and shaped me as I grew. So when I got, into the point where you could start choosing what you wanted to take in school and what you wanted to focus on, it was inevitable that I took the direction that kind of fed those interests and those concerns. Ultimately led me to seminary.
As you look back at those influences, was there a particular influence, either a person or an event or an issue where something just absolutely clicked for you and you felt alive and empowered in a way that you hadn't before?
I can't really talk about any kind of mountaintop. I know you're not using that terminology, but in terms of clicky, it just seemed to me to be, even though I admittedly fought against it sometimes. I mean, I considered teaching an academic career. I considered being a lawyer. I considered being a forester. I mean, all these things that you take these interest surveys in college or in high school, and I was supposed to, according to one of those surveys, I was supposed to be a concert pianist. So all sorts of activities or possibilities were occurring, but it just seemed to me to be, looking back on it particularly, that I just never strayed very far away from that compass direction, if you will. What was it, Buechner's comment that the sense of call is where your great joy meets the world's deep need. It's a little grandiose from my perspective, but not really off topic. I mean, I think it probably has as much to do with where you find your interests aligning with the demands of the task. And as you know, I love words. Ministry is all about words and language and communicating stories and interpreting meaning and so forth. It's all about being aware of the world through reading and taking in the experiences of others through the various media and personal encounters and so forth and so on. I enjoy very much those kinds of encounters, literate and interpersonal. It's all about trying to understand our motivations, both external and internal, and very much a concrete part of what ministry is all about. Is trying to be empathetic, sympathetic, and perhaps even a bit wise about where people are coming from, and that takes a great deal of self-understanding. I've always been interested in myself too, so interpersonal explorations have always, I think, been part of this. I think it's just an alignment issue that I think is significant for us as we determine what our vocational goals are and so forth. And those just aligned with me.
How did that love of words that you talk so much about and your seminary experience intersect? What doors were open to you as you began exploring biblical texts and learned in Greek and Hebrew and so forth? What doors open to you and your understanding of words in that setting?
I was doing a children's sermon one time at church and kind of set the kids up, and I said, do you have a favorite book? And as kids they were all ages, so you got all different kinds of titles and so forth. And I said, you know what mine is? The Bible. I said, no, it's the dictionary. And I think it's because it's through language of all kinds that we articulate, we take in, and then we re-articulate the gospel. And when I got to seminary, I had obviously, I'd been an English minor, and I had taken German for foreign language requirements and so forth and so on. It wasn't until I got to seminary and took Greek that I realized that if you don't know Greek, you don't know English, because about half the words there are. And as the people that have attended my Bible studies know, I get pretty tedious about the roots of English words and what they mean in Greek. And because the New Testament was written in Greek, to expose those various meanings can open up whole new avenues for taking Bible verses down different paths than people are used to. Because any translation of the Bible is an interpretation of the Bible. And to have additional tools, I was never very good at Hebrew, I'll confess that up front, but Greek really fascinated me. And to be able to take familiar passages and take them down a different route because there are other possible definitions or translations of words that were originally used in the original text, I think is fascinating. That opens up for people new ways of exploring themselves and exploring their faith and exploring what is demanded of the church now. You just look at Bible translations from different eras in history. Every Bible translation reflects a different consciousness of an era. How can people of the 17th, 18th, 19th century interpret the Bible to approve of slavery? I mean, for instance, well, that was their milieu, that was their era. It's not to excuse it, it's just to say there was something in their consciousness, but also in their translations that enabled that to happen, that won't allow us to interpret things that way. It's not entirely a matter of definition, there's also other things going on, obviously, but that's part of my fascination with all of this. And if one of the things I've always struggled against is kind of the rigidity sometimes that is settled in within the church regarding definitions and translations and understandings of what the Bible is demanding, when actually the Bible should be seen not as something that rigidifies us, but something that frees us and opens us so that each era can build on the past, but can understand more freely what perhaps God is inviting us to see and do in this new time.
So what do you think it is that God is inviting us to see and do, or what is demanded of the church in this particular era?
Well, I'm not sure the subject matter has changed generally. You know, we're our biggest enemy is always ourselves, it seems to me. Our failure to understand our motivations, our habits, our routine ways of understanding things, our passions, and so forth. I think the biggest shift, perhaps, that still needs to occur, and has occurred in large segments of the church, but clearly not in all segments of the church, is that, and this is just my theology, my understanding, that the call of God to the people of God is not to purity, it is to obedience. The characters of the Bible, none of them is pure. And I'm not critiquing Jesus here. I'm saying that all of the people that followed Jesus, all of them were fraught personalities. They were all just like us, divided in our loyalties and challenged in courage and confused in motivation. Even the clearly most devoted and focused ones, maybe like the Apostle Paul, so he's presented to us in Scripture, you know, confesses to his own weaknesses and his own lack of faithfulness at times and so forth. I mean, it's a very human kind of book, but we treat it as though it's full of plaster saints sometimes. I think large segments of the church treat it as a treasury of golden nuggets that we can just pluck out and apply someplace. And I just don't think that's the way it works. The Bible is there to interrogate us. The Bible is there to ask us questions, and it asks some of the most difficult questions in the world. You know, but what do you have if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? You know, that kind of question. You know, I think that one of the most prescient questions, one of the most focused and difficult questions is out of the words of Pontius Pilate. You know, what is truth? It's kind of fundamental to what we're all about as the church. If the Bible is seen, or the church is seen, as just a route to heaven or not, that doesn't necessarily make us good. I've told the story before in church, and I think probably in our conversations, Neil, that when I first started out in ministry, I was calling on an elderly woman who, at one point in the conversation, she was kind of a feisty gal. She fixed me with kind of an icy stare, and she said, "Reverend O'Neill, I want you to know I have never sinned in 20 years. Frankly, didn't know quite what to do with that, you know. But, you know, looking back on it, I think what she meant was that she had not committed any against any of the 10 Commandments. And that doesn't, just obeying the 10 Commandments doesn't make us good. It doesn't make us kind. It doesn't make us sympathetic. It doesn't make us work for justice. It just means we haven't killed anybody, or, you know, cheated on our spouse, or stolen our neighbor's ass, or something like that. I mean, it's a minimalist list, when actually the Bible, and especially the Sermon on the Mount, which is really the hardest, or the most complete core of ethical teachings in the Scripture, kind of rewrite the 10 Commandments, right? You've heard that it said, "Thou shalt not murder," but I say to you, whoever's angry with his brother, and so forth and so on. The whole ethical command of Jesus contained in the Sermon on the Mount just explode expand, I don't mean destroy, I mean expand our sense of discipleship, and focus us radically on what it means to be a person of God, not just check off a list of do this and don't do that. Because most of the things that are critical in life cannot be defined in terms of don't do or do. It's a personal response to the call of God in an individual moment about how to do justice, how to show mercy, how to walk humbly with our God. Those are moment-by-moment decisions that can't be imposed by a rule book, which the Bible is not, in my view.
So in this moment of time, especially maybe in quarantine time, which is different than Chronos time or any other Greek time that we have, how can we find ways to radically love, radically follow Christ in this particular moment that we find ourselves in, that none of us asked to be in?
You know, I think the first call is to it's one of the shortest commandments of Jesus, I think, is fear not. It's a scary time. It's very scary. And I'm not saying that I haven't been frightened by it. You know, I find myself frightened for my children, grandchildren, my brother and sister. You know, all of us are getting into in the elderly status, and, you know, vulnerable. With my own health challenges and so forth, I felt very vulnerable. I have a spouse who's reminding me that I got to, if we have to shelter, I have to shelter more than anybody else because of underlying conditions and all that stuff. And that applies, you know, to millions and millions of people. So I think it's hard. I think the first task, in a way, is to take seriously and to find the spiritual resources in our faith that enables us to fear not, because it's a very, very scary time. Because, I mean, fear limits us. Quite beyond the order from officials and medical personnel to shelter in place and to not interact and to maintain physical distancing and so on and so on. Fear is the kind of thing that can maintain spiritual distancing, because then it becomes all about us, or all about our little coterie of, you know, the people we care most about, or just our neighbors, or our neighborhood, or whatever, our nation. I hear, as we all do, the reports on television, news or radio of the affliction. I often hear some of the representatives of government saying, you know, this is happening, these numbers are growing, et cetera, but we are the greatest nation on earth. And at that point, they lose me, because I wonder, what does that have to do with it? What's that have to do with faith? I think that's a form of a fear response. It's almost like saying the rest of the world is also infected, but we don't care about them. We're the greatest nation, so we'll be all right. And it's that kind of response that narrows our vision and narrows our concern. And I'm not saying that anybody is in the position of saving the world from this virus, but it seems to me our compassion and sympathies need to be expanding at a time like this, if anything, and not narrowing and shrinking. And the physical distancing, of course, limits what we can do, but it doesn't have to limit our generosity, where our resources may be called for money and so forth. It certainly shouldn't limit our prayers. It should not limit, for many of us who are in the position to do so, to physically serve one another. Everything from delivering groceries to supporting homeless shelters and that sort of thing. We hear about the trouble that hospitals are in, and the peril, in a sense, that our healthcare workers are in. So are social workers. So are those who enforce the laws of our society, the policemen and the fire persons, and so are the grocery workers. So are all the people that are still going to have that kind of contact with us. So I don't know what all the tasks are. I think they're probably beyond my imagining. But I think if we start with tamping down the fear and opening up the generosity of spirit and hope regarding the outcomes of all this and what it'll take to get there, we keep in our mind the visions of Jesus touching the lepers and so forth, and healing the sick and dealing with the dead as he did, even though that was a great taboo in his and other societies. If we can spiritually project ourselves through those things, it seems to me we will be showing forth the degree of our discipleship. And we need to think together about it. I mean, what Eastminster's response can be, I don't know. We depend so much on getting together and exchanging ideas and feeding one another insights and inspirations and contributing our knowledge from place to place. Getting together virtually will help that the more we can do it. But I think at this point, all of us are more concerned about hunkering down. And that's an obstacle or a threshold, maybe it's a better way to think of it, as a threshold we've got to overcome in order to free up the generosity of spirit and support that we might generate if we put our heads together.
I think you use the term spiritual distancing, and I'm really drawn to that term on this because of the nature of hunkering down and not putting our faith in hurricane preparedness mode, where we shelter our windows and doors from the storm, and yet what are the ways that we can run to? And I think that's an important question for the church, and certainly not one we're going to answer today, but it is important, and I'm grateful to you for bringing that question up. In the life of the Presbyterian Church, my favorite 4 words are words that are asked and included in the ordination vows for ministers of Word and Sacrament and ordination installation of elders and deacons: energy, intelligence, imagination, and love. And I'm wondering, where have you experienced those 4 words throughout your ministry? Which one do you see happening still today?
Oh, I think they're abroad in the church. I mean, one of the things I cherish about the Presbyterian tradition, well, there are many things I cherish about the Presbyterian tradition, but it seems to me it's a tradition that, as I have experienced it, and I suspect as you have, being another child of the manse, so to speak, is that ministry thrives on imagination, right? And it's not necessarily imagination in the minister, although it helps, but the imagination that's alive in the church that we can engender when permission is given within the church body, to allow people's imaginations to flow freely, and I think that's one of the things our tradition has done. In the churches I have been privileged to serve, it's been generally true in every one of them, although, every human community has its blind spots, not unaware of that. But in terms of where there are no blind spots, where there's a real sense of vision, our tradition has engendered, encouraged, and released imagination, it seems to me, because our tradition has always insisted that we don't have the final answer. Just because this is what we believe, we're not saying that what you believe is wrong. Here's what we think at this time, but it would be, I'm trying to think of the language that the Book of Order has used. It's not sinful, but wrong, something like that. It would be an act of hubris to say that this is the only possible way we can understand God being alive and at work in the world. This is just where we are right now. And that anything that needs to be brought up and discussed can be brought up and discussed. Nothing is forbidden to be discussed here in this church. That in itself gives permission and freedom to people to be more themselves, to actually share out loud the visions that they may have, even though it may detour from where they are, where their fellows are. And I think in terms of energy, intelligence, imagination, and love, that's a way of embodying that in a church body, is to honor the insights and experience of all members, old members, new members, young members, elderly members, men and women. One of the greatest things, and I'll say this in spite of the fact that Kristen might be watching this at some point, that one of the great things that's happened in our church and in other denominations, obviously, is women entering the ministry. Women have always been in ministry, but to enter the professional ordained ministry of the church was far too slow in our denomination, but nonetheless it happened, and it was one of the great releasings of imagination, insight, sympathy, and drive. I would say, I don't know about your father, Neil, but my father in his era, he entered the ministry in, the late 30s and retired in this middle 70s or so. He never had a female colleague, professional colleague. I don't know, I'm not implying that therefore his ministry was, cramped, but in a sense, maybe it was, because that whole realm of women in ministry who were very active in ministry, but in non-ordained forms in the church, in his experience, was in a sense disparaged, just by virtue of not being honored as a professional way of enhancing the leadership of the church. By the same token, and they're not the same, obviously, but to the extent that we now also enjoy the leadership of other ethnicities, ordained ethnicities in the church, that we have large communities of Koreans, large communities of Hispanics, large communities of African Americans, and so forth. They need to be much larger in our church, but the Christian experience as we know it in America has changed so radically in terms of our partnerships and our relationships and so forth. I'll include my father's experience and my experience, roughly 80, 85 years or something of experience, how much that has changed. And just in terms of those 4 key words that I think are key to all of us, there's been so much released in terms of what we're able to do, what we even perceive we are being called to do by virtue of the inclusion of other people than those that look like us.
You mentioned that demographic changes that the Presbyterian Church has embraced over the years, even though some of them took longer than they should have in history, but we got there faster than some others, which we're grateful for. In terms of change, what has been one of the most, or some of the most significant changes that you've seen in that span that you just named of decades of ministry, not only growing up in the church, but through your ministry, professional ministry, and into now? What's been one of the most significant changes that you've seen, and what do you think is a change that the church needs to be considering as we look forward into this next continued century?
Boy, that's a tough question. You know, I frankly see some negative changes more clearly than perhaps I see the positive ones, other than the ones I've already mentioned. Just to dwell on the negative for a minute, one of the things I regret deeply is that I think there has been a diminishment of our ecumenical spirit in the church. I've always felt that I had good relationships with clergy of other denominations and so forth, and it was always tried to be active in organizations that brought us together ecumenically, kind of for the same reason that I was talking about the inflow of new kinds of leadership in the church, which brings so many new insights and, you know, releases more imagination and so forth, as I was talking a few minutes ago. But there has, I think, there's been a diminishment of ecumenical agencies that the church is participating in. Ecumenicity, which, you know, sought to at least bring new understanding among denominations of one another, and perhaps therefore a new understanding of the breadth of the faith, used to thrive in interfaith cooperative institutions within communities. It's hard to find those now. I mean, there are more clusters of like-mindedness than there are clusters of difference anymore. And if we think in terms of clusters of difference and put that up against what pundits are constantly calling a deeply divided America politically and, you know, in many other respects, I think we begin to see how starkly we miss those kinds of clusters of difference. You put those two, we're depending on the difference to keep us apart anymore instead of bringing us together. And I think that's a problem. It seems to be more of an enclave mentality going on. Even churches can become little enclaves where they no longer feel a part of the whole. I'm not trying to sound too sour grapeish here, but it just seems to me that some of these themes, the more there is the inclusion of some of these, what we might call historically newer communities within the church, perhaps we're getting back to that original theme again. People become a little more fearful. And instead of coming together and embracing one another, they're finding ways of staying apart and holding out in little enclaves. That's a fear I have, and one of the things that I've seen happen. On the other hand, I think we have had to deal over the last, you know, several decades with a change in perception about maybe who we are. The Protestant church and the Presbyterian church in particular, but along with many other churches, I think increasingly find ourselves marginalized in society. Christianity has gotten defined inappropriately, as far as I'm concerned, as being of an evangelical fundamentalist, almost a political action committee type of organization. So we have a lot of religious issues being played out on a political stage, which I think represents a fracture in the church universal, if there is such a thing, really. But it also represents a diminishment of our ability to speak and be heard. I've referred to my father and his battles against the McCarthyism of the 50s, or the anti-civil rights attitudes of the 60s, and so forth. In our community, which was a community roughly the size of Lansing, but in Illinois, he could be heard, when he spoke out, because he represented the Civil Rights Commission of the city, or the Human Relations Commission of the clergy, ecumenically gathered in the city. And so when he or the council on which he served took a position on something, whether it convinced people, I don't know, but they had to listen to it. Where is our mouthpiece now? Where is our unified front? What organization can we name that really is clearly identified as a Protestant voice of what we used to call the mainstream Protestant denominations? Where do we hear that voice now? It just, I can't say it's silenced. I mean, it's heard from the pulpits. It's heard from our stated clerk of the denomination. It's heard in many ways by the people to whom they speak or who want to hear it, but it's not necessarily heard by the society. I cannot remember the last time I read a newspaper report or anything that singled out a religious leader of the mainstream church, or used to call the mainstream church, saying something and focused on it. It's usually from the evangelical community, and in my view, often a distortion of the core Christian message of love and acceptance and embracing of God's whole people and serving them according to what Christ has called us to do and be. So, sorry, I kind of gone to the negative there, but I think those are conversely then things we ought to strive to create again, and would not in any way say that that's not possible. It's just right now it's very difficult, very difficult.
So to take from that difficulty, what would be a hope or a prayer that you have for the church?
I hope the church as it presently exists would learn to embrace itself in a way. And I'm using church capital C. So, every denomination you can think of. I mean, there's like 400 denominations in the United States alone. So I'm talking a little grandly here, but historically and culturally, I think we wouldn't have to go back very far to find common ground with a wide variety of people that and denominations that could have a common voice if they decided it was worth having one. I would hope they would find it. I think our, just to be local for a minute, our nation, certainly the world, but I think our nation really needs to hear some clear statements of moral and ethical courage these days, articulated in a loving and hopeful spirit. And I think the church is one of the few organizations that is fundamentally equipped to do that, even though it doesn't do it very much. Again, an awful lot of the pronouncements we hear coming out of religious organizations are almost cynical in their style, and almost corrupted in terms of their ideological bent. Part of the problem is that I think we've perhaps lost our common theological language. And I don't mean highfalutin theology or theological language. I mean concrete theological language. We've lost the broad base of that language, in the sense that if you talk about a biblical story, most people would have, 40, 50, 60 years ago, most people would have recognized it as something out of Scripture, for instance. Or if you use the word grace or mercy or something, they would have recognized it as religious language. I'm not sure that functions anymore, but anyway, I would hope we could regain that somehow. I'd be the first one to say I probably retired at the right time, because I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to coalesce that anymore. We are dealing with smaller and smaller faith communities and worshiping communities. I entered the ministry very late 60s. 1965, I think, was the high water mark of membership in the Presbyterian Church. So I entered just after the crest. We talk about flattening the curve, these days in terms of the disease. Well, that's when the arc started to flatten in terms of Presbyterian Church membership. And it's been diminishing pretty steadily ever since. So obviously we've lost, or never had, or we had cultural winds blowing against us so fierce that we couldn't really counteract them for the last 50 years been going on. I don't want this to be heard as a hearkening after the good old days, because we all know those weren't all that good in so many respects. But I think we had a voice. And I think that the biggest problem is not that we've lost our voice, but that nobody's listening. And that's the challenge. Whether this is a kind of a concertina, it expands and then it contracts and it expands and contracts, and that's how you get the music out of it. I'm hoping that's how the music's going to come out of the church. I mean, in a good way, out of the church, broadcast out of the church. This is a world desperately in need of faith against fear, and kindness against coldness. And I know of no institution, organization, community better equipped to do it, to give that, than the church. So you figure it out, Neil.
Thanks for that. The challenges of ministry in these days. So God being our constant throughout all that undergirds our life of faith, and you talked earlier about scriptures that challenge us, that sort of read us. That's not exactly the term you use, but kind of read us or convict us or challenge us.
Interrogate us.
What scripture in particular, has there been one that has remained steady or constant in your life of faith, that has been a go-to source of inspiration, or one that you go back to over and over, that interrogates you?
Yeah, many hard teachings, if we really took them seriously. I mean, what if Jesus really meant what he said? That's time and time again. Go sell all you have and give to the poor. I mean, what if he really meant that? And I think he did, at least in that, given instance. What if he meant in the Sermon on the Mount that whoever is angry with his brother or sister has committed murder, essentially, spiritually? Those are hard truths to hold. I got to say, though, that some of the most instructive pieces of scripture that keep coming back and informing me in one way or another, a lot of them come out of the Old Testament. One of my favorites is Jacob and the story of his wrestling the stranger or the angel, depending on what translation you read. Jake has been alienated from his brother, and is come to the point where the next morning he will cross the river and encounter his brother for the first time in, I don't know, 20 years or something like that. And Jacob is this roguish character. You talk about unholy people. I mean, he's Jacob means heel grabber. You remember, he's a twin with Esau, and he comes out of the womb second, but he's got his little fist clutched around Esau's heel. And so he's named heel grabber. I think that's an interesting word picture or name picture. What does it mean if Jacob is any kind of model for us, and there's more literature about Jacob in the Old Testament than any other character. More pages, more ink is spilled about Jacob than any other character in the Old Testament. So he's an important guy whose stories reveal a lot of the history of Israel in its formation and so forth. And Israel, another word interesting, it means, struggling with God. So that's germane to the story I'm getting to, but Jacob's going to meet Esau across the river the next morning, and that whole night, as the story tells it, he encounters this stranger, this strange thing, an angel or something, and he has this wrestling match that goes on until dawn. Well, I think I always take it kind of metaphorically as he's wrestling with his conscience. He's wrestling with his own personal history. He's wrestling with his faults and his fears and his hopes and his dreams. Dawn starts to come, and the stranger says to him after this lengthy, sweaty wrestling match, I've got to go because the sun's coming up. And Jacob says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And I just wonder, you can take this in all sorts of different directions, but I just wonder, as individual Christians who have our own wrestling matches of conscience, of interpersonal struggle, of direction in life, of disappointments, of illness and loss to death of loved ones, and maybe even ourselves. All these wrestling matches that are a part of life. I wonder what it would mean for each of us to think, I'm not going to let go of this until I wrest a blessing out of it. Or, in a wrestling match with somebody else, I'm not going to let them go until I have been a blessing to them. Just seems to me to be one of those motivational key points that we could think about before we just, kind of wash our hands of whatever we're struggling with. Oh, forget it, that can't be solved. It's the people in the past. You asked the question earlier, who's been an inspiration to me and so forth. It's the people in the past who have done that in their witness, in their church, in their business, in their family lives, in their interpersonal struggles and so forth, who have come out of those encounters with difficulty, feeling somehow blessed by God, blessed by somebody else with whom they were wrestling, or have been a blessing themselves, been encouraged by the fact that they've been a blessing themselves. There are a lot of different ways of defining that, I know. It's one of those things that you could easily excuse yourself, self-righteously saying, well, I've been a blessing, I can, wash my hands of this. That's, I don't think, what's going on there. Because the rest of the story is that Jacob does cross the river, does reunite with Esau, and goes forth from that point. It's a story of reconciliation. And that's what the blessing fundamentally is. It's being reconciled to what has happened in the past and what might happen in the future.
Well, I think we are grateful for the blessings that you and Sam have been and continue to be to Eastminster as our time nears an end here. And I didn't know what I was going to call these conversations, but I think it's come to me as been having this conversation with you this afternoon. I think we're going to call these things Faith Matters. And so it's the last question that I want to ask before we end our time together. What matters most to you about your faith in Jesus Christ?
Oh gosh, that's a magnificently large question. It's kind of like putting a top 10 on one's life in terms of experiences and so forth. This, I don't know where this ranks, Neil, but it's been a privilege for me to be in the ministry. When we started out talking, you were asking kind of what led me into all this and what was formative and so forth into getting into the church. Talked about my childhood and so forth. But I also said at that point that I had a lot of points at which in fact, a couple of points at which I tried to leave the ministry. Not out of a sense of abandoning it, but just needed a new direction. I needed some refreshment. I needed to do something else because for whatever reason was going on in my life and so on and so on. None of those detours led me anywhere. And looking back on it from my advanced age now, you're asking the question in terms of my faith in Christ. I am grateful that I was found to be in the church, doing what I did with the bulk of my life. To me, it's kind of a mystery. It's not something, as I hope I've been clear about, not something that I always chose. And at the time, will confess that I wasn't always as faithful to it as I should have been. And at times was probably more doing it, either staying in or leaving for my own purposes than Christ's purposes. But looking back over the path and the history and so forth, I can come out at this end saying, whatever it was that kept me at it and focused me, I'm very, very grateful for. So if that's faith or an aspect of faith, I'll accept that. Sometimes faith boils down to what choice do I have? And sometimes faith boils down to, I've got this really good opportunity and this really good opportunity, I'm taking this one. I mean, I think faith takes so many different forms and plays a dynamic role at so many different points in our life. What faith is not is certitude. If we're certain about everything, we don't need faith. We don't need trust in something external to us. Certitude is destructive of faith, and I'll be the first to admit that I've been uncertain about a lot of things. So when we speak and articulate what we've been through and what we've thought and how we've decided, I think we're always kind of catching up with ourselves and defining faith now in terms of what we experienced then. And having caught up with myself at this stage in my life, I'm very, very grateful that I was received into the company of clergy, received into the faith community of the Presbyterian Church, nurtured and shaped and formed and inspired by that community, and enabled to do whatever it is I've done. That's my faith journey, as rocky as it often has been, but one that I am happy to look back upon with gratitude.
And gratitude for you and for the time that you've given us, not just today, but throughout your ministry. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure.